Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode breaking down the verses in the Book of Mormon. We're going to look at 1 Nephi chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. We've already looked at verse 9 on its own. We're going to look at 9 and 10 together as a unit. The question being posed here is, did Joseph Smith accidentally write a Bedouin poem with Hebrew influences? All right, what are we talking about? A Bedouin poem. Okay, ancient Bedouin poetry of travelers is pretty unique. There was more than just Lehi and Nephi and Laman and Lemuel and the family that moved from town to town through the Saudi Arabian desert, or were nomad travelers. There's these group are called Bedouins, and they had specific rituals and traditions, all their own. Camel riders would chant short 2 to 7 line poems to entertain the travelers and stimulate the animals to keep time. The poems consisted of 2 verses that compared their surroundings to their circumstances, and the group would divide into an alternate, chanting verse 1 and then verse 2. So the traveling party would have 2 groups. One would chant the first verse, a short 2 to 7 line poem. The next group would chant the same verse, or the second verse of the same poem, a short 2 to 7 line poem, back to the first group, and they would alternate back and forth. It was a way to entertain them as they traveled, to help the animals keep time, to really pass time, and often to learn and to teach. So Laman's group would have said, "Oh, that thou mightest be like unto this river, continually running into the fountain of all righteousness." And then Lemuel's group would have said, "Oh, that thou mightest be like unto this valley, firm and steadfast and immovable, in keeping the commandments of the Lord." The interesting thing about it is, remember, Nephi isn't writing this down at the time. He didn't go and say, "Hey, today my dad said this about Laman and Lemuel." This is something he remembered 20, 30 years later and wrote it down. To me, that gives me the idea that, he's giving a pretty specific quote from his father here. If it wasn't written down before, it must have been embedded in his mind pretty well, and it could have been embedded in his mind by chanting it back and forth for hours on end as they traveled through this area of the Saudi Arabian desert. Hugh Nibley is the one who actually discovered these poems, and it wasn't discovered until the 1950s. And remember, Joseph Smith wrote this Book of Mormon, or translated this Book of Mormon, whatever you choose to believe, in the early 1800s. So over 100 years later, the poem was finally discovered, that this matches all the unique characteristics of an Arabian, Bedouin, Aramaic poem. They are Brunenlieder and Kielenlieder, as the Germans call them, meaning songs inspired by the sight of water gushing from a spring or running down a valley. This is a very specific type of poem used by these ancient people. They are addressed to one or usually 2 traveling companions. As we talked about, the 2 traveling companions goes hand in hand with the 2 verses. They praise the beauty and excellence of the scene, calling it to the attention of the hearer as an object lesson. 4, the hearer is urged to be like the thing he beholds. 5, the poems are recited extempore, or on the spot, and with great feeling. They are very short, each couplet being a complete poem in itself. One verse must be followed by its brother, making it a perfectly matched pair. So these were all the characteristics of all the ancient poetry that they have found in this area. And of the 7 characteristics that a poem needs to qualify as an authentic ancient Bedouin poem, Lehi's 2 verses here in chapter 2, verses 9 and 10, fit all 7 criteria. And again, this wasn't found until the 1950s. Let's say by chance Joseph Smith had learned this ancient poetry, the rhythm, the cadence, all 7 of the criteria that was needed. Why didn't he ever mention his entire life that, hey, anybody check out these poems I wrote, these ancient Bedouin poems that I wrote in these chapters and verses? Wouldn't that have helped convince people who eventually killed him because of this translation, because claiming this translation was from God. It's interesting that he never brought that up, because obviously he did not know that he had written two ancient, authentic Bedouin poems. He simply translated them without knowing exactly what they were. So you can see here, they all line up. The Brunnen leader, he sees a river running through the valley. It empties into a sea. They are addressed to one or two traveling companions, addresses two of his sons traveling with him. They praise the beauty and excellence of the scene, makes the majesty of the scene an object lesson for them. This is comparing, the 7 criteria to exactly what was used by Lehi to qualify. So we've been through most of those. One other interesting idea is this influence of Isaiah. Now remember, Isaiah to these people was the most recent major prophet that they had writings and teachings from. This is who they would have studied. They would have known people who knew Isaiah, and thought him to be a prophet, obviously. And so we have a poem from Isaiah in Isaiah 48:18. "Oh, that thou hast hearkened to my commandments, then had thy peace been as a river, and thy righteousness as the waves of the sea." This is a perfect, again, Hebrew, Bedouin, Aramaic style poem. And now, if Lehi is writing a couplet that would go next to this poem, as a second and third verse, or even just a second verse all on its own, then we have a perfect parallelism. So, "Oh, that thou mightest be like unto this river, continually running into the fountain of all righteousness." So you see the righteousness, both keywords are used. Righteousness, and then in verse 10 he says, "And he also spake unto Lemuel, Oh, that thou mightest be like unto this valley, firm and steadfast and immovable, in keeping the commandments of the Lord." So the second idea is commandments, where in Isaiah the first idea is commandments. There's a river, and righteousness is used as the first idea by Lehi and the second idea by Isaiah. So if you put them side by side, it's a perfect Hebrew parallelism and a chiasm. Was this an influence of Lehi when he came up with his poetry? Subconsciously or consciously, I don't know, but it fits great. And the Isaiah chapter is a perfect example of this ancient poetry, and another evidence of the authenticity of the Book of Mormon.